Forget everything you were taught in history class about Christopher Columbus being the first European to set foot in the Americas. We have known for a while that the Norsemen reached the shores of Newfoundland around the year 1000. But for decades, the consensus among scholars was that this was a brief, failed experiment, a hit-and-run operation that lasted maybe a decade before the Vikings packed up their longships and sailed back to Greenland, intimidated by the vast distances or the resistance of the local indigenous populations. But that narrative is currently being dismantled by a wave of groundbreaking scientific evidence that suggests the Viking presence in North America was not just a historical footnote. It was a centuries-long saga of exploration, resource harvesting, and survival that lasted far longer than anyone previously dared to imagine. Imagine standing on the deck of a wooden nair, the wind whipping through your woolen cloak as you stare out at a coastline that isn't on any map. To your left, the icy reaches of the North Atlantic. Ahead, a land of dense timber, wild grapes, and endless possibilities. This wasn't a vacation. It was a high-stakes gamble for survival. We are now finding evidence that these voyages weren't just isolated events. New dating techniques, satellite imagery, and genetic analysis are painting a picture of a persistent Norse connection to the New World that may have lasted well into the 1400s. That is nearly 500 years of European presence in America, before Columbus ever spotted land in the Caribbean. This changes everything we know about the medieval world, the capabilities of Norse navigators, and the interconnectedness of our planet long before the so-called Age of Discovery. For a long time, the only real evidence we had for Vikings in America were the Vinland sagas. These were oral histories passed down for generations before being written down in Iceland during the 13th century. They told tales of Leif Erikson and his family sailing west to find lands they called Helluland, Markland, and Vinland. Most historians dismissed these stories as legend, much like the tales of dragons and trolls, until 1960. That was when a Norwegian couple, Helge and Anne Steining Stad, followed the clues in the sagas to a small fishing village in Newfoundland called Landsok Meadows. There, they found the unmistakable remains of a Norse settlement. They found sewed houses, a blacksmith shop, and even a bronze cloak pin. It was the smoking gun. The Vikings had definitely been there. However, once the initial excitement wore off, the academic community settled on a very limited view of this site. Based on the amount of garbage left behind and the lack of permanent structures like large barns or stone fortifications, experts concluded that Landsok Meadows was merely a temporary base camp, a place where ships were repaired and supplies were gathered before the explorers headed back to Greenland. They estimated the stay lasted maybe 3 to 15 years. It was viewed as a failed colony, but that conclusion was based on the technology of the 1960s. Today, we have tools that can peer into the very fabric of time, and the results are shocking. In 2021, a study published in the journal Nature changed the timeline forever. Researchers used a new type of radiocarbon dating that focuses on solar storms. In the year 993, a massive solar flare hit the Earth, leaving a distinct spike in carbon-14 in the rings of every living tree on the planet. By looking at wood fragments found at Landsok Meadows and identifying that specific solar spike, scientists were able to count the rings and determine exactly when the trees were felled. Every sample they tested pointed to the year 1021. This was a precision never before achieved in archaeology. But it was just the beginning. While 1021 marks the year the Vikings were actively cutting timber at that specific site, other evidence suggests they were still hanging around much later. If you look at the Greenlandic colonies, which were the jumping-off point for these American expeditions, they survived for nearly 500 years. These weren't small outposts. At their peak, the Greenland settlements had thousands of people, dozens of churches, and a thriving export economy based on walrus ivory. To survive in Greenland, these Norsemen needed timber. Greenland has almost no trees suitable for building ships or large houses. But right across the water, in what we now call Labrador and Newfoundland, were the vast forests of Markland. It makes zero sense that a seafaring culture living in a treeless environment would discover a continent made of wood and then just ignore it for 400 years. New pollen analysis from peat bogs near Landsok Meadows suggests that the landscape was being managed and utilized long after the supposed abandonment of the site. We are seeing evidence of wood species that don't belong in certain areas showing up in Norse contexts much later than expected. If they were going to Markland for wood, They were likely staying for seasons at a time, creating a revolving door of exploration and resource extraction. But why didn't they stay forever? Why didn't they build cities? This is where the story gets really interesting. We have to stop looking at history through our modern lens of colonization. The Vikings weren't looking to conquer a continent. They were looking for resources to support their existing homes in Greenland and Iceland. To them, America was a massive grocery store and hardware shop. It was a place to get walrus, ivory, fur, and timber. Recent satellite imagery and high-resolution thermal mapping have identified several potential new sites along the coast of Newfoundland and even further south into New Brunswick and Maine. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence for a longer stay is the discovery of walrus DNA. Researchers have been analyzing walrus ivory found in Europe during the Middle Ages. For a long time, it was assumed this ivory came from Greenland. But genetic testing has revealed that as the Greenland walrus populations were overhunted, the Norsemen began venturing further into the high Arctic and across to the Canadian Arctic to find new hunting grounds. We are finding Norse artifacts like chainmail and carpentry tools in indigenous settlements far to the north, suggesting a complex network of trade and interaction that lasted for centuries. Think about the logistical mastery required for this. These people were crossing some of the roughest waters on the planet in open boats. They were navigating by the stars, the behavior of birds, and the color of the water. If they were making these trips for 400 years, it suggests a level of familiarity with the American coastline that we have never given them credit for. There are hints in the sagas of lands even further south where the weather was warmer and the grapes grew wild. For years, people thought Vinland was just Newfoundland. But the wild grapes mentioned in the sagas don't grow that far north. They grow in New Brunswick and New England. This brings us to a controversial but fascinating possibility. Did the Vikings explore as far south as New York or even the Chesapeake Bay? While there is no definitive archaeological proof yet, the geographical descriptions in the sagas match the coastlines of the eastern United States surprisingly well. If they were searching for resources and better land, why would they stop at the rocky shores of Newfoundland? The more we look, the more we find hints of their presence. Minted in the 11th century was found in an indigenous site in Maine. While one coin doesn't prove a settlement, it proves that Norse goods were moving through the continent long after Liv Eriksson's initial voyage. The interaction with the indigenous people whom the Norse called Skraelings is another crucial part of this puzzle. The sagas describe both trade and conflict. If the Vikings were only there for a few years, these interactions would have been fleeting. But if they were there for centuries, we are talking about generations of contact. This would have led to an exchange of ideas, technologies, and perhaps even biology. Recent genetic studies of certain populations in Iceland have found a unique DNA marker that is typically found only in Native American populations. This suggests that at some point, perhaps around the year 1000, a woman of indigenous American descent traveled back to Iceland with the Vikings. Her descendants are still there today. This is a mind-blowing realization. It means the first Americans to reach Europe did so 5 centuries before the world even knew the continents were connected. Now let's talk about why this stayed hidden for so long. For a long time, North American archaeology was dominated by a Eurocentric view that prioritized the Columbus narrative. Anything that didn't fit that timeline was often ignored or labeled as a hoax. Sites were dismissed because they didn't look like European cities. But the Norse were adaptable. They used local materials, which rot away in the acidic soil of the North American forests. Unless you find a very specific metal artifact or a stone hearth, a Viking house looks like a grassy mound after a few hundred years. However, with the advent of LiDAR technology, which allows us to see through the thick forest canopy and map the ground surface in incredible detail, we are finding anomalies all over the Atlantic coast. Many of these could be natural, but many others show signs of human modification that don't match indigenous building patterns. We are currently in a golden age of Viking archaeology in America. Every summer, teams of researchers are out in the field using ground-penetrating radar and chemical analysis to find the footprints of these ancient explorers. The environmental factors also played a huge role in their long-term presence. The medieval warm period, which lasted from about 900 to 1250, made the North Atlantic much easier to navigate. The sea ice retreated, and the coastal areas of Newfoundland and Labrador became more hospitable. This was the window of opportunity that allowed the Norse to expand so far. But even when the climate began to cool into the Little Ice Age, the Greenlanders didn't just give up. They were a hardy, resourceful people. They transitioned their diet from farming to seal hunting and continued to sail west for the precious timber they needed to keep their ships afloat. Imagine the life of a Norse sailor in the year 1300. You are part of a crew of 30 men. You leave the settlement of Brattahlid in Greenland in late spring. You sail west for a few days until you hit the coast of Markland. You spend the entire summer felling massive oaks and pines, dragging them to the shore, and loading them onto your ships. You might encounter a group of local hunters. You trade some iron needles or knives for furs and dried meat. You build a temporary shelter, catch salmon from the rivers, and prepare for the journey back. This wasn't a grand conquest. It was a job. It was a way of life that persisted for as long as the Greenland colonies were viable. The mystery of why the Greenland colonies eventually disappeared in the mid-1400s is still debated. Some say it was the cooling climate. Others say it was a collapse in the ivory market. Others point to conflict or plague. But whatever the cause, when Greenland was abandoned, the link to North America was finally severed. By the time the Portuguese and Spanish ships arrived in the late 1400s, the Viking paths had been grown over by forest, and the memories had faded into the realm of myth. But the evidence remains. We are finding more than just houses. We are finding evidence of iron smelting. This is a massive tell. Indigenous populations in North America at that time didn't smelt iron. If you find a slag heap or a furnace in an ancient layer of soil in Newfoundland, it belongs to the Norse. We have found these sites, and they are spread across a wider area than just Lansox Meadows. This long-term presence also explains the mysterious maps that appeared in Europe before the official discovery of America. For example, the Vinland map, which shows a large island west of Greenland, has been the subject of intense debate for decades. Others argue it reflects a genuine geographical knowledge that filtered back to Europe through the Norse routes. Even if that specific map is fake, the knowledge of land to the west was a known secret among many European sailors and mapmakers who traded with Iceland. When we look at the big picture, the Vikings weren't just explorers. They were the first true globalizers. They connected the snowy peaks of Scandinavia to the steppes of Russia, the markets of Constantinople, the deserts of North Africa, and the wild forests of North America. The fact that they maintained this connection for hundreds of years changes our understanding of human movement. It shows that the Atlantic Ocean wasn't a barrier, but a highway. And the people driving on that highway were much more sophisticated and persistent than we ever gave them credit for. So where do we go from here? The next decade of archaeology is going to be incredibly exciting. With refined carbon dating, DNA sequencing from ancient middens, and more satellite surveys, we are likely to find more settlements. We might find evidence of Norse wintering sites as far south as Cape Cod or even the Great Lakes. The more we look, the more we realize that the story of America is much older and much more complex than the version we were told in school. The Vikings weren't just passing through. They were here, they were active. And they were part of the American landscape for centuries. They saw the same sunsets we see, walked the same beaches, and navigated the same rivers. Their legacy isn't just in the ruins of Newfoundland, but in the very idea of exploration. They proved that with enough courage and a sturdy ship, there is no boundary that cannot be crossed. We aren't just learning about the past. We are redefining the narrative of our entire species and how we came to inhabit every corner of this earth. Think about the sheer scale of the North Atlantic. Even today, with modern technology, navigating those waters can be a nightmare. But the Norse did it in ships made of wood and leather, guided by the flight of birds and the feel of the current. To do that once is a miracle. To do it for 400 years is a testament to an incredible culture of maritime excellence. These voyages weren't accidents. They were calculated, professional operations. The Norsemen had a map in their heads, a mental geography that included the coastlines of the New World as a familiar part of their territory. When we consider the historical implications, it's also important to think about the culture they brought with them. They brought their laws, their stories, and their unique way of looking at the world. While we don't have evidence of permanent Viking cities, the cultural exchange with indigenous groups must have been significant. We found Norse-spun yarn in indigenous sites, suggesting that local people were learning or observing Norse textile techniques. This wasn't a one-way street. It was a dialogue between two very different cultures that lasted for half a millennium. When we rethink the Viking presence in America, we aren't just adding a few more years to a timeline. We are acknowledging a lost era of American history, an era where the roar of the North Atlantic was met by the sound of Norse axes in the forests of Labrador and the laughter of children in sod houses on the shores of Newfoundland. The newest evidence, from the microscopic level of pollen and DNA to the global perspective of satellite imagery, is all pointing to the same conclusion. The Vikings were a persistent, enduring part of the American story. They were the first Europeans to call this land a resource, the first to navigate its treacherous northern waters, and the first to build a bridge across the Atlantic that lasted for centuries. As we continue to dig, to analyze, and to explore, who knows what else we will find? The stories of the sagas are coming to life, proving that sometimes, the legends are more grounded in reality than we ever suspected. The next time you look at a map of the world, don't just see the lines between continents. See the paths carved by these ancient sailors. See the connection between the fords of Norway and the bays of Canada. It's a connection that was forged in wood, iron, and a spirit of adventure that refused to be contained. The Vikings were here, they stayed, and they left a mark on history that we are only now starting to fully understand. The saga of Vinland wasn't a short story. It was an epic, and we are just beginning to read the final chapters. Recent discoveries have also highlighted the importance of small things. For years, archaeologists looked for big buildings. They are looking at the isotopes in the teeth of ancient animals found in Norse middens to see where those animals were raised. They are finding that the Norse in Greenland were eating caribou and seals that likely came from the American side of the Davis Strait. This kind of chemical evidence is hard to argue with. It shows a consistent, diet-based reliance on the resources of North America. Furthermore, the study of ancient climate data, known as paleoclimatology, has shown that the routes between Greenland and Canada were ice-free for much longer periods than they are today. This opens up the possibility that for several centuries the trip across the water was no more difficult than a coastal journey in Norway. This environmental context makes the long-term presence of the Vikings even more plausible. They weren't fighting the ice every single day. They had an open door to the west. It's also worth considering the psychological impact of these voyages. For the people living in the small, isolated communities of Greenland, the knowledge that there was a vast forested land just a few days' sail to the west must have been a powerful motivator. It provided a sense of security. If the crops failed or the winter was too harsh, there was always Markland. There were always the riches of the West. This mental map of America as a backyard resource would have been passed down from father to son for generations. As we look deeper into the genetic history of the North Atlantic, we might find even more surprises. We are just starting to map the genomes of the ancient Norse and the indigenous populations they encountered. If more evidence of interbreeding is found, it would be the ultimate proof of long-term, intimate contact. It would mean that the Vikings didn't just visit America. They became in some small way a part of it. The story of the Vikings in America is a reminder that history is never truly settled. It is a living, breathing subject that changes as we develop new ways to see the past. For 100 years, we thought we had the timeline figured out. We were wrong. The Norse presence was deeper, longer, and more significant than we ever imagined. And the best part is, we are still finding more. Every new artifact, every new site, every new DNA sequence is a piece of a puzzle that is rewriting the history of our world. So stay tuned because the evidence is still coming in. We are uncovering a world where the Atlantic was a bridge, where cultures collided and traded for 500 years before the world was ready to listen. The Vikings were the first to find the New World. But more importantly, they were the first to stay and make it a part of their world. Their endurance, their skill, and their long-vanished colonies are finally getting the recognition they deserve. The evidence is clear. The Vikings were in America much longer than we thought, and their saga is far from over. This long duration of Norse presence also shifts how we view the end of their era. It wasn't a sudden departure or a dramatic defeat. It was likely a slow fading, a gradual retraction as their homelands in Greenland became unsustainable. But for those 4 or 5 centuries, the American Northeast was a frontier of the Norse world. It was a place of work, a place of trade, and a place of survival. When we look at the ruins of Lansox Meadows now, we shouldn't see a failed colony. We should see the northernmost tip of a vast network that spanned the entire Atlantic. In the coming years, as more sites are identified and more data is analyzed, we will likely find that the Norse footprint in North America is much larger than just a few spots on the coast of Newfoundland. We are looking at a story of a people who were perfectly adapted to the cold, the sea, and the forest. A people who saw the potential of a new continent and utilized it for as long as they possibly could. The evidence is there, hidden in the soil, in the rings of trees, and in our very DNA. The Vikings have been a part of the American story for 1,000 years. It's time we finally acknowledge the full scale of their achievement. The persistence of the Norse in the Americas is a testament to human resilience. It challenges the idea that history is a series of clean breaks and clearly defined eras. Instead, it shows a messy, overlapping, and fascinating world where different cultures knew about each other long before they were officially introduced. It's a world where a blacksmith in a sod hut in Newfoundland could have been hammering out iron nails from local bog ore while his cousins were trading walrus ivory in the markets of Paris or Rome. That is the true scale of the Viking Age. It was a global phenomenon that reached its fingers across the ocean and touched the shores of America for half a millennium. As we wrap up this exploration of new evidence, remember that the most exciting discoveries are often the ones that challenge our established beliefs. The idea of a long-term Viking presence in America does exactly that. It forces us to rethink the capabilities of medieval people and the interconnectedness of our past. The Vikings weren't just raiders and warriors. They were sophisticated navigators, resourceful settlers, and enduring explorers who made the North Atlantic their own. Their story in America is much longer, much richer, and much more complex than we ever dreamed. And thanks to modern science, we are finally beginning to see the true picture of their incredible journey.